Hello, everybody. It's Mike Quaranta with the Delaware State Chamber of Commerce, and thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon, U.S. Political Election Update. And that's going to be coming to us with Ashlee Rich Stephenson from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we'll get started in just a minute. It's 12:01, I believe, and we're going to give people another minute just to get logged in and give everybody a chance to settle in. But before we turn this over to Ashlee, I want to just mention a couple of things real quick. Excuse me, our Superstars in Business event, as you can see, is coming up on November 4th, and we're very excited. And if you have not registered to participate and attend, we would encourage you to do that. If you go to dscc.com, hit our events tab, and find the event on November 4th, you can register. We've got a great lineup. If there ever was a time to recognize small businesses and nonprofits that have really kind of gone the extra mile and in all these challenging times, boy, this would be the year to do it. So draw your attention to that, and please register if you've got some availability on the 4th of November. And then also our next Chamber Leadership event is coming up, and that's going to be on December 3rd. And this is going to be with Jim Collins. Jim is the CEO of Corteva Agriscience. And this is and I've said this a bunch of times, the Chamber Leadership programs are some of my favorite of everything we do. It's an opportunity to hear from a leader, and in this case, the CEO of Corteva, and, the leadership journey. How did you go from where he grew up and was educated to the chairmanship of a very large corporation, and what was the journey like? What are some of the challenges? And I find these always kind of very personal and very enlightening. So put that on your calendar and register for that one too. That's on Thursday, December 3rd at 8:30. Okay, so let's get to the heart of the issue. We are in the political season for sure. And let me welcome Ashlee Rich Stephenson. So Ashlee is the Vice President and National Political Director of Political Affairs and Federation Relations at the United States Chamber of Commerce. She leads the Chamber's voter education program and includes directing the endorsement process on behalf of pro-business candidates for federal office, and also guiding the Chamber's independent expenditure account program, which is all of that is all very, very important. She's nationally recognized and respected. She's been a political strategist. She's been involved in several campaigns, senior in a polling firm or two, and is just an experienced political hand. She lives in Alexandria, Virginia, back where I had my very first home back in the day. I lived in Delray, Ashlee, and she's a native of Pittsburgh, an alum of Allegheny College. As a native Chicagoan who went to college in Minnesota, I always thought Pittsburgh people were more Midwest than they were East. So without further ado, I made one mistake because I was going so fast here. Hold on a second. I've got to ask James Deshane to step in for a minute. James is our sponsor for today, and then we're going to come back to Ashlee. So I apologize. I was just going too fast and looked right past my notes. So James, who used to work, Ashlee, this will be of interest to you too. He used to work here for several years, and then he was a regional political director up in New England for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He's now with the firm of Armitage Deshane, and so James has graciously agreed to sponsor today's event. So let me first lateral this over to James to say a few words, and then we'll come back to you and we'll go through your deck. So James.
All right. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, as Mike alluded to there, I am an alum of both the State Chamber, heading up their government affairs program, and also with the U.S. Chamber covering 11 states. And we formed Armitage Deshane and Associates last year. So we are a full-service government relations firm handling traditional lobbying, communications, crisis communications, but we also dig a little deeper and can work on policy development, relationship building, so getting you and your firm in front of members of the General Assembly or other regulatory agencies that may touch your business throughout Delaware. And we also can be of assistance for if you're looking to go through an RFP process for local, state, or federal government contracting purposes. We can help you guide through that process as well. So it's always nice to be a participant at the state chamber here. Nice to have the U.S. chamber. I don't think Ashlee and I think in your department now, it's probably been so long since I've been there that there's probably nobody left that I know, but it's a great organization, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ashlee has to say from the federal perspective. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
James, thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to mention that James is on retainer here and does work for us in Dover, and we're pleased to have him connected. Both he and Rick do great work for us, and grateful for that. So Ashlee, they didn't want to hear me gas on, so go ahead. We're really interested to hear what you've got to say, and give us some insights, please.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike. And I would be remiss not to start off by saying that I live in Delray. It's where I am right now, more the Rosemont section, but we've been here for a number of years, almost 10 in Delray. So we love it, and it's changed a lot. So with that, greetings to everybody from Northern Virginia. Today's federal political update is going to touch on a number of different things that are happening in the environment. And of course, top of everybody's minds, and I would imagine very much in Delaware, as you are potentially on the cusp of electing a new president, we'll see on Tuesday or in the weeks afterward, is the presidential race. So just to get started, I thought it would be worthwhile to cover what our top political priorities are on this next slide. We have three real strategic goals that we've followed through the cycle. First is to maintain a pro-growth majority in the U.S. Senate. We think that this is the backstop for the business community, our membership, and it's just been something we've been endlessly focused on, and we'll be watching very closely on Tuesday evening what happens in a lot of states, and I'm going to get to. 2 and 3, encourage bipartisan governing, and we know 2 can't happen if we, on behalf of the business community, don't support more centrist House Democrats in the House where Democrats are in control now. It's been a huge focus of our political activities, our legislative activities, and we've been very proud of the progress that we've made in doing just that, getting critical pieces of legislation passed and signed into law, like the USMCA being a nice example. So moving on to our top political priorities, the next slide starts to detail what has happened this year. And I'm a pollster, so I get really interested in public opinion and how things are changing. And the tale of January 2020 to October 2020 couldn't be any more stark. You all are living it just like I am through the coronavirus pandemic, serious racial unrest across the country, now just incredible early absentee voting. And when you look back at where we were at the beginning of the year, it's significant. Top concerns at that point, we had 5 or 6 things that were driving discussions. Of course, healthcare and the economy, evergreen 2 top issues in an election season, environment, immigration, Social Security, even education, which isn't on this list. Now, keep in mind, this was happening during the backdrop of a very heated Democratic presidential primary season, which most of us have forgotten about by now, but the world is definitely much different than at the start of the year. Moving on to the next slide is a quick overview of some questions or outstanding question marks. This is a slide I took from a gentleman named Bruce Melman, who does some of the best forecasting decks, I think, in Washington politics. They produced this and called it Final 2 Months Where the Wild Things Are. We know that this year we've had 3 big surprises since the start of September: the awful passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, then the White House getting COVID-19, the president actually going into the hospital in early October, and we have a question mark next to confirmed. Well, that actually ended up happening a couple days earlier this week, of Amy Coney Barrett. I left a question mark because who knows what twists and turns we're in for between now until Election Day. I personally am over the twists and turns like most of America, but in 2020, I'm unwilling to bet on anything. So looking back to 4 years ago, there were at least 6 big things that took place. Lastly, Comey reopening the investigation into the emails that happened, and I think today is the 28th, exactly 4 years ago, if you can believe that. It was actually about a week out from the election. So who knows? The scary thing is that question mark, and I hope that box doesn't get filled between now and Tuesday. Moving on to the next slide. Enthusiasm to vote hits historic high. Gallup has tracked enthusiasm basically since the beginning of time, since Gallup started public opinion research to participate in elections. This is kind of a boring slide, but the big story is 71% of voters are more enthusiastic to vote than usual. We've never seen these numbers in Gallup cross into the 70s. They've been doing this longer than anybody else in the public opinion research business. And it's indicative of what we thought all along heading into 2020. Turnout was going to be off the charts. It was in 2018. We called that a 100-year flood event. And of course, with the early and absentee voting, which is on this next slide here, we can start to see where things are with all these folks who are participating early and try to compare that to 2016. I always say take this with a grain of salt. It's really an apples and oranges comparison. We've never had early and absentee at the numbers like we're seeing in 2020 because of the pandemic and so many states changing their own laws to afford voters the ability to participate in ways they feel safe and comfortable, and certainly much earlier. But today we crossed over to 70 million votes that had been cast. Whenever I submitted this deck, we were at 59 million. Now we're at about 71 million. 51% of early and absentee votes in the door account for total turnout in 2016, which is about 135 million voters or so. There's a chance that in a lot of these states, we're well over 50% of total 2016 numbers about a week from today. So it's something we're tracking really closely to try to make sense of, especially in the Senate races, going back to our first priority, to distill if there's anything happening there that we can read the tea leaves and make some guesstimates. I always am very cautious with early and absentee numbers, not only in 2020, but before now, because it's all over the board and it's impossible to really know what's going to necessarily happen. But on to this next slide, something for you to be mindful of. Election day is likely to be election week. There are 30 states that aren't going to start counting any of the earlier absentee ballots until election day. And this includes some big battlegrounds, including for you all nearby Pennsylvania. And I'm going to talk about the presidential in a little bit more length, but there's a chance that this goes on not only into the wee hours of Wednesday morning, but potentially weeks ahead of us as well. And lastly, just covering what's happening with early and absentee voting is this question of, is election day on the next slide likely to be like election week, or excuse me, a red mirage? Something that's been said in the press regularly. You see that method of voting, which is detailed on this slide from a Pew report, shows that in person before election day, these are the people that go to the polls and cast a vote early in person. 55% prefer Biden, 40% prefer Trump. By mail, these numbers get more helpful for the vice president, 69% versus 27%. But election day is when it's expected to be a landslide, maybe 2-1 for President Trump. 63% of election day voters are going to support the president, 31% for Biden. So the key factor here is, as you're seeing these numbers being tallied on election night, these are folks mostly who participated in person that day. The president might be up by a lot, but back to those 30 states that don't start counting until election day, we could be waiting a while to get the ultimate results here. And it's going to be really fun. I should conclude this section by saying, to be in a newsroom that night, I can't imagine what some of that forecasting is going to look like as these pundits are trying to figure out, okay, the president's up by 20, but how many absentee ballots are out? Who did they come from? It's going to be pretty wild and something interesting to watch for sure. Moving on from early and absentee voting, this next slide is a quick peek at historical direction of the country. And is there a party change in the White House based on the mood of voters and how they feel about how just things are going in general? We see, going back in history, anytime right direction is at 20% or less, there's been a party change at the White House. Today, right direction has been sitting anywhere between 28 and 31% on average. Incredible to be reminded of that just 12 years ago, only 12% of the country said we were going in the right direction. Of course, the big question mark remains, is this enough for it to be a party change? Who knows? But voters are decidedly more happy than they were 12 years ago. So another one of these fun variable type exercises to try to make some sense of what's going to happen. Beyond historical direction of the country is looking at voting starts early and it's getting late. The key point here are the job approval numbers. Sort of a tough chart to read. And Mike, I see you moving your face closer up to the screen. The point here is to look at Trump job approval in late October and early October compared to his predecessors. Trump today is at about 43% on average of his job approval. Bush in 2004 was at 49, Obama 49, Clinton, we don't have a number, but he sat relatively high, always in the 50s during that last year before his second term. It was a different time in American politics. I think Americans were much happier. But going back to Bush, George H.W. Bush, he was at 36%, so lower than the president today on job approval. Reagan was at 58, closer to those Clinton numbers. The one thing I can tell you we do know about President Trump is he's a disruptor. He has upended the way that traditional public opinion research in some ways is conducted and then ultimately analyzed to try to figure out, is he on track to be reelected, or does it even really matter during the Trump era? Some of these normal things we look at to make some guesstimates as to the potential outcome. Beyond this slide, looking at the next one, is handling the economy. And in some of these presentation decks, I've had 3 to 4 slides on this issue alone. As I mentioned at the outset of the discussion, there was a number of things voters cared about at the beginning of the year. Today, this election is going to come down to 2 things: the economy and jobs, healthcare, and the coronavirus. The one thing the president has left positive for him on the issues is handling of the economy. He's net positive on the Real Clear Politics average today by about 3 points. And there's constant hand-wringing from Republican strategists in the press saying, gosh, we just wish the president would talk about jobs and the economy, not Hunter Biden, not necessarily crime and some of those issues. Focus on the one thing that works for you. He's finally started to get there. Yesterday, the president and the administration were previewing GDP numbers that weren't going to be out at that point for 3 days. Now it's 2. It's like they're finally getting the message, but it might just frankly be too late to get into some of the next slides I'm going to show. Moving on from here to slide 12, just back to that point. Most important key issues by groups. The economy certainly is the one that's best with Trump voters. Healthcare and coronavirus is a lift for Biden voters. You see below that, most of these are basically second-tier issues. So it would just serve the president well to stay focused on he's the best one to get the country back to where they were at the start of the year. Moving on to slide 13. Biden and the DNC have led in fundraising. The president and the RNC collectively really built a huge infrastructure to raise a ton of money, starting immediately after he was sworn into office in January of 2016. The vice president and his team caught up with him quickly once it crystallized that he was going to be the official Democratic nominee. This really started in August to become glaringly clear how big the financial discrepancy was going to be between the two. In August, Biden and his team did $365 million compared to $210 for Trump. I know these seem like huge numbers, but when you're looking at the almost entirety of the country, or at least 10 huge battlegrounds, these dollars get spent pretty quick on advertising. In September, Biden did $383, more than $140 million more compared to Trump's September at $248. Home stretch cash on hand advantage, the president had about 35% in the bank compared to what Biden did. Not a great place to be in the last few days of the election, particularly when you're losing. And the same story for Trump and the RNC plus Biden and the DNC. Moving beyond just these fundraising numbers, these are the 6 big states to watch on election night. I call it the Sun Belt versus the Rust Belt. Sun Belt's Arizona, Florida, North Carolina. Rust Belt's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. On average, Biden has been up in all of these states, but just this morning, new polling showed that the average roll, all of this available on Real Clear Politics, the president is now up by 0.4 percentage points in Florida. It's basically been about even in North Carolina. But for all of you to be watching on election night, the president cannot lose Arizona, Florida, or North Carolina. In the Rust Belt, he can lose Michigan and Wisconsin, assuming he doesn't lose those top 3, must win Pennsylvania. His path is narrow compared to the vice president. The 2 states to watch that aren't on this list are Georgia and Ohio. If either of those states go for Biden, it's done. The president won't be able to mathematically recover unless if he picks up all of those Rust Belt states, and that just looks really tough, particularly Michigan, where he's been down by anywhere from 8 to 10 points on average. Moving on from this slide to take us to 2016 averages versus 2020 in the polling. This is another dangerous one, but it's too much fun to not include. Apples to orange comparison. Please don't take this and print it out and sit down and treat it like your scorecard. But it is fun to see where we were 4 years ago and comparing these races in the publicly available polling data to today. On average, the big story is Secretary Clinton, while she led Trump almost everywhere, she never hit 50. Vice President Biden does hit 50 in his average in Michigan. I think he's going to win there. I think he has it put away. Pretty close to 50 in some of these other ones. Pennsylvania, 49.8. North Carolina, 49. Certainly in a better place than Secretary Clinton was. We'll see if it's enough in a couple of days or a couple of weeks, whatever it's going to be. Next slide, slide 16. This gets into the meat and potatoes of our focus at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's the Senate. Republicans are solidly on defense. Today they hold 53 seats. Democrats have 47. There's an assumption, just to do a quick back of the envelope math to explain where this whole race is, that Republicans are likely to pick up Alabama, taking this to 54 seats. Assumptions are that they lose Arizona and Colorado, which is a 52 seat scenario then. And then going straight into those toss-ups, Republicans cannot lose in the lean column Alaska, Kansas, or Texas to stay at that 52 seat, or else it's going to be real trouble and really problematic from the math. Going into the toss-ups, I would classify Montana and South Carolina as almost toss-up light, more like a lean. I think it looks like, based on the public polling, those stay where they need to with the current incumbents that we've been supportive of at the U.S. Chamber. The big three. This is what will decide the likely balance of power on election night, are Iowa, Maine, and North Carolina. I think the fates of the senators in North Carolina and Iowa are directly tied to the presidential race. They are very close to the president on their ballot score. Maine is a very different story. As you all know, being in the Northeast, these aren't states that are going to vote for President Trump. Anybody running in the Northeast as a Republican has to have a really strong split ticket program to get those people who support Vice President Biden to come and support them on their own ballot. Susan Collins is as tough as they get. She's run a really strong campaign. She's been outraised. It's been the earliest spending contest in federal Senate election history, but the data we're looking at shows this pretty close, potentially a coin toss at this point. So I would pay close attention to Maine. Moving beyond this slide, I have just a couple of more. Democrats outraised Republicans in Q3, just as we saw at the presidential level, almost by 2 and 3 times the amount. Jamie Harrison in South Carolina did almost 58 million, just stunning numbers like we've never seen in politics before. I don't know where we go from here, but it does tell you that the intensity and the excitement is certainly with many of these Democratic challengers, as it's looks to be about a 50-50 chance, if not slightly better, that Democrats could pick up the majority next week. And then lastly, taking a peek at the House. Oh, I'm sorry, this is good just to have, and you're welcome to share these slides. These are the pre-election finance and cash reports, something I always look at very closely because, again, back to my point, who has the most cash on hand going into the final home stretch could make a difference. There's about 5 or 6 of these races where Republicans have slightly more money, but with the absolute windfall of data, as we saw, that's a tough place for some of them to be in as they've been outraised. And then going to the House, Republicans need 17 seats to get a majority. Most forecasters are saying that Democrats are poised to pick up anywhere between 5 and 15 seats. I think that's a real likely reality. Republicans are solidly on defense. I pulled a quote that I read last week from a Politico story about just spending in the House. Even if a Republican were to win re-election to the presidency, being Trump, on average, they bring about 6 or 7 seats with them. I think the math here looks pretty difficult. Again, I'm not willing to bet the farm on anything in the Trump era, but I see it as a real long shot, probably impossible. And my last slide's about redistricting before we go to some questions. 2020 census projections show us that these Sunbelt states I talked about, many of them are set to pick up a couple of seats in the U.S. House. The not too far away from you, many of the Rust Belt states and going up into New England, a handful are set to lose a seat or two. What this ultimately means is it will affect redistricting and then the Electoral College in 2024. So we could be looking at a very different political map the next time we hopefully are all together, albeit virtually or in person, doing a briefing like this ahead of 2022 and then the presidential election. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Ashlee, terrific. That was fantastic. Thank you for that. I've got a million questions. So I want to go back to one. You mentioned when you looked at the president and you talked about economy and jobs, and he gets good marks for that. How does that square, though, with a number of people in Rust Belt states who, when he campaigned 4 years ago, said, hey, I'm going to bring those good jobs back, AKA manufacturing and maybe low skill but high wage jobs in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and places like that. How does that sort out? Because it doesn't seem to be materializing in some of the polling figures in those places in particular.
I would say two things, and your question it's a timely one, Mike. I just pulled together this morning all of the latest unemployment numbers by state. The first thing I would say is you have to run against fear, and fear of the Green New Deal is a reality. Fear of no fracking in Pennsylvania is a real reality. So even if those jobs haven't come back in the way that some hope, particularly in the coal and manufacturing industries, looking down the barrel of a potential Green New Deal and stopping the oil and gas production as we know it is a real issue, I think, and gives the president an opportunity if he could capitalize on that appropriately. And that seems to have been a bit of a challenge by staying on message. Looking into some of these states, Michigan has the highest unemployment of the big battlegrounds at 8.5%. A lot of this is pandemic related. Closely following that is Ohio at 8.4%. And I think that's why you've seen Ohio in recent weeks coming online as a potentially an opportunity for Vice President Biden. It doesn't square. Most things never do in politics when they're talking points and spin. I guess that's what makes this so much fun or so ridiculous at certain times. But I think that the ability to effectively communicate that the economy, as you've all known it in the oil and gas industry and fracking and things like that, or the automotive industry in Michigan, is an opportunity that should have been capitalized a little bit differently than maybe it has been.
Interesting. Let's take a look at not geographies, but maybe different demographic groups. In my career, I worked for a U.S. senator from Minnesota, and what brought me to Delaware, I was chief of staff to a former Republican congressman from here, very moderate by anyone's scale. Suburban voters, suburban women voters in particular, what does the data tell us about performance with the vice president or the president? And has there been any marked shift from 4 years ago for the president with any of those important demographics?
Sure. So the tail after 2018 was definitely suburban women voters voted strongly against the Republican Party, putting Democrats back in control in the House. Those numbers have not gotten better. They've gotten worse for sure. So as much as the president, it's been interesting. And recently in Pennsylvania, he stood behind the stump and said, suburban women, you should love me. I saved your suburbs. And I even saw some signage that the Trump campaign has out for these rallies about Trump protecting the suburbs. I don't think that resonates. The backlash is so strong, so severe. It's too little too late to say the absolute least. I think that the big demographic group to watch next is suburban men. Some folks have talked about that as the new suburban women. The president's numbers have not been where they need to be with suburban men compared to 2016. And beyond that, there are a couple of other big groups we're going to be watching for on election night as much as we can, knowing that traditional exit polls are going to be tough to come by with so much early and absentee voting, but that's seniors. And during the pandemic, the president really started to suffer with seniors. After he was diagnosed with COVID-19, the national public polls showed incredible slippage for him with that group. That's key to the makeup of his pathway to victory. So I don't think that helped him actually coming down with COVID and going to the hospital with that audience.
It's interesting. And talk for a bit more maybe about, there's been discussion, and we got one question that came in. There appeared in 2016 to be hidden Trump supporters, people that maybe didn't particularly like the style, but they liked the message, they liked the background, the experience. Frankly, they didn't like people like me or you who were Washington insiders. They wanted to throw all of us out And this was kind of a primal scream from the hinterlands. It's like, all you guys that did great in civics class that do politics for a living, we're done with you. We want to bring in an outsider. Where does that stand? Are there hidden Trump voters this time, do you think?
Well, I'd say the president's first problem, Mike, is that he is no longer an outsider. He's an insider. So trying to run on this message of drain the swamp again, I think is tone deaf. That was definitely, of course, the key focus of 2016, and it was very effective for all the reasons that you just listed and more. I think it's impossible to know from the polling view if there are as many hidden quiet Trump voters. What happened in 2016 is the weighting was incorrect for voters without a college degree. There were way too many folks in these polling samples of voters with college degrees who are, of course, more favorable to Secretary Clinton. I think that the thing that the polling industry, I know having lived it, really faces as a challenge is it's more difficult, expensive, and timely to get people on the phone, even compared to 2 years ago, who are willing to talk to pollsters. So that's just an issue that's been happening for some time now, and it's been expedited during the Trump era, where there's sort of this lack or shyness of a desire to actually talk to pollsters about where you are.
Thank you. So let's talk about actual election day voting and people showing up. Are we expecting, you pointed early on in your presentation that early voting is breaking all sorts of records. Are we expecting long lines on election day, or do you think some of that has kind of been moderated by the fact that so many people have already gone ahead and voted? And also that has implications. And actually, if you could take a second talking about this too, within the last week, how much space is out there for the vice president or for the president to convince people who's left, who's eligible?
So it's definitely going to be to first tackle the line question. It's going to be a state by state, probably county by county scenario. And in Texas, 87% of all voting from 2016 is in the door, early and absentee. The question nobody knows how to answer is, how farther beyond that 100% level is Texas going to go? And does that ultimately mean long lines at the polls? So, I don't know. That's going to be one of the 20 or more really interesting things to watch on election day, to hear about the lines at the polls. So tough to forecast for sure. Who is left to convince one way or the other? Going into election day 2016, about 10 to 15% of voters nationally were undecided. There was a strong belief that Comey reopening the email investigation helped President Trump. Today, there's only a handful on average, roughly between 6 and 7% in the national polls. Some of the states, it of course looks very different of who's left, but it's at least half, if not more than a third, of all of that percentage of undecided in 2016. It's a much more narrow gauntlet for the president to run to try to persuade them. Gotcha.
I had a question in the chat box about the South Carolina Senate race. Worked with Senator Graham when he was a House member, and actually also spent a few years as a colleague at a lobby firm in DC with Jamie Harrison. And the question was, and I think it's probably going to be a pretty easy answer, how much of Jamie's money was raised in state and how much of that just came from out of state?
A lot of it out of state. I don't know the exact percentages, but there's just not that much money in South Carolina politics to fund that $58 million level. And we're seeing that across the country. Democrats' platform of Act Blue is just such a significant lift to their efforts. And of course, there's an excitement across the country to hopefully take back, from their view, the Senate for Democrats.
It most certainly would be interesting. I think that if you asked me years ago what state might have 2 United States senators from the Black community, I'm not sure I would have picked South Carolina for sure, but that could be an outcome. And we didn't talk about this, and I'm going to catch you maybe a little flat-footed here, but I'm kind of curious. Any thoughts about any key races for governor? Because you mentioned in your deck about redistricting, and I think that is a very, very important topic. And let me set this up this way. When Neil and I were serving in the House of Representatives together at the same time, Neil Bradley, of course, your colleague at the chamber, one of the complaints that then Speaker John Boehner had was, Mike, I've got 435 people, about 300 of whom general election day does not matter. Their real election is the primary. And when they come to Washington, then their behavior is quite predictable. They never vote for any deal under any circumstance because the primaries tend to reward the most liberal or progressive on the left and the most conservative on the right. And so they don't want to be considered caving into special interests or not being true to their stripes. So we get this problem where you have districts that are drawn up to be decidedly Democratic or decidedly Republican. And so very few, so we get these handful of districts in the middle that kind of bounce back and forth. So redistricting really matters. So where do you, and you had a map of, where there's going to be growth and where there's going to be takeaways. And all that kind of unfolds because you get a census and then you get the redistricting. What are any more details, any thoughts about how that relates to the chamber, the business community, and things like that?
Well, the governor's races question is an interesting one. For better or for worse, there aren't that many exciting or as tough contests as there are in the Senate race. And of course, when there's a presidential year, it tends to overshadow everything. But of course, what happens at the state level is what makes the difference. And it certainly does to us from a business community perspective, which is why our partnership with you, Mike, and the Federation means just so incredibly much to the U.S. Chamber, because we know state legislative policy has a real set of ramifications for the business community. When it comes to redistricting, each state does things differently. There's been a number of Supreme Court rulings, even in the last few months, knocking back some of these potential gerrymandering issues. So what I think is going to be fascinating to pay attention to, again, long laundry list, beyond the gubernatorial contest are the races for state legislature, all out across the country, more than 1,000 seats up. And if there's a blue wave, that ultimately will be very helpful for Democrats in states where the legislature gets to draw some of these district lines. Now, on the ballot where I live in Virginia, there's an initiative to set up a bipartisan panel that drives redistricting, and it's no longer would just be done by the governor with the help of the legislature. It would be a separate entity. And some states have that on their ballots this year as well. I worked on an initiative like that actually in Michigan last year, and it was really fascinating. I think that putting more hands in those decisions in a bipartisan setup are probably better, but I'm no expert by any stretch whatsoever on those issue sets and gerrymandering. But of course, like any, believe it's good for democracy to have equal representation.
You raised another topic real quick that are there any ballot initiatives in different states that you're aware of that are driving the conversation, or is everything this year really just a referendum as it appears on the president?
There's actually a ton of ballot initiatives across the country. It's just not getting as much attention as some of the big ones used to get, particularly whenever there would be same-sex marriage fights and things like that. I think it was Prop 8 out in California. I think it may have been in 2008. But there's a big one in Arizona we're following closely. Pretty sure it's Prop 208. And it's about the tax environment, would increase taxes on upper earners and I think businesses. So that could potentially be problematic for Arizona as a state that's attracting such a new growth in population from places like California, where citizens are fleeing the taxes and regulatory environment. So that is one we're involved in, and we're opposed to that tax increase.
We've been very active here on a couple of issues. They've not shown up and they've not manifested themselves into ballot initiatives, but you're right, on some of those subject issues, there are nexus to employers. We had an issue, or we had a question that came into the chat about public safety. Can you talk a bit more about public safety? There's and how that's is that more wishful thinking, or is that really kind of you mentioned kind of the experience of the president and his team trying to use that as an effective lever in suburban voters, but kind of walk us through if there's a little bit more. I don't know if there's any, crosstabs that come to mind in terms of particular groups, like where's the issue and who are they really trying to push into the riots that happened on Memorial Day weekend or in the aftermath of George Floyd or in Minneapolis or some of these other places where we've had kind of a culture conversation. Is this kind of manifesting itself? Do you see safety issues appearing maybe in, say, the Minnesota races or some of these, or maybe Kenosha or in Wisconsin or places where there's been kind of a local event?
I definitely thought so for a while, Mike, and believe that these scenarios, and as unfortunate and awful as they are, potentially could provide an opening for some of those undecided voters and to course correct what we talked about earlier, the opinion of the suburbs as it relates to the top of the ticket being President Trump. I think that you have to imagine the calculation as he and his team saw the events of Kenosha as an opening in some ways to remind voters across the country. They've said that this is what Joe Biden's America would look like. And I don't think that frankly, I don't think defunding the police really helps any of those who don't take a hard stance against that, in my personal opinion, looking at survey research data. I think it could move very small slivers, very small pockets of the electorate. It's not your big issue that you close out your campaign with. It's more of a wedge issue to help with some of those problems that perhaps Republicans have been facing in the suburbs.
The Channel 47, which is an ABC affiliate, asked what are the main political interests for the state chamber and for the U.S. chamber, and I'll answer that first from our perspective, and that is that frankly we have people who have we hopefully elect people who have the interests of employers and employees in mind. We have an economy that is the envy of the world. We are seeing a lot of disruptive changes in a lot of different industries. The disruptions are happening more frequently. They're more dramatic. And that's why we're so heavily focused here on workforce development, training, retraining, because we think those are things that help employers and by extension their employees remain relevant for an entire lifetime and a career. So those are some. So we look for candidates who have that kind of compass as something that they tack from. Ashlee, anything you want to add or say from the U.S. Chamber?
You put it perfectly, Mike. We look to support men and women who are willing to work across the aisle. We're very much a nonpartisan or bipartisan organization, depending which way you look at it. And having the appetite, the willingness, and the gumption to work across the aisle in today's environment, I think takes guts. And those are the kind of people that we're supportive of because it's critical for the business community and job creators to have a functioning government. Those being two key words, functioning government, very important. So
talk to me and share with everybody about some thoughts about the polling industry for a minute. A lot of criticism was directed at the industry a couple cycles ago because numbers, especially the 2016 presidential, because numbers were indicating, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, how there was perhaps some undercounting of overcounting of college educated males, but maybe undercounting of males without a college education. And it's more difficult. It's proven more difficult as a society that we all turn to phones that are like this as opposed to landlines and the traditional methods. What are some of the strategies that the really on top of it and kind of really good polling firms are using in order to be as accurate as possible? And again, it's polling, right?
Yeah. So two things. First is 2016, the national polling was about right at the end of the day. Hillary was up by about 2.5 points. That's where it ended up overall. Getting into the private pollsters and how some operate and some don't, it comes back to a conversation that really at the beginning of my career, we started to see. I worked in conservative politics. Democrats had to evolve and adapt quicker to be able to get to those sectors of their own primary electorate who were less likely to have landlines, perhaps younger, more difficult to get a hold of in some ways. So Democrats did a really great job, especially during the Obama era, modernizing their techniques and using data being the key point of this, the remarks I'm about to make. Really great pollsters use data science to figure out who's going to participate in election. I think more of the traditional old school pollsters produce weighting methodologies and sample, looking at historical turnout, and then just guess and kind of hope for the best. And what I've seen this year, and it's endlessly frustrating, pollsters that don't include vote history and individuals with 0 of 4 participation on their record. This is all available data that you purchase as a pollster. It's a huge mistake, and that's because so many of these organizations have failed to adapt by using data science to look to the future. I think that using data science and statistics is an important part of the polling industry. Democrats did a great job, led on that for a long time. Some in the Republican space have caught up, and analytics has become a much bigger conversation. They go part and parcel with polling. They're not separate. They should live together. And any of you who work on campaigns or even on behalf of your organizations, if you're conducting market research, ask questions. Are you using data science to build your sample? How do you know who is going to turn out? And demand clarity, because it's an expensive product. It's like buying a very expensive car every time you go out and field a survey, many times. So I would want to be very clear on what it is I'm getting before I'm paying for data that helps me make some of the biggest decisions on behalf of my campaigns or organizations.
That's great. Thanks. So let me ask you this: as a, I know you have 2 children. I'm a father of 3, and several of our members have heard me say this before, but witness bad family planning right here. All 3 of my kids are in college this year, so I'm just a walking ATM. But younger voters without a history. And so as we, and it's interesting, they're dispersed. One is international, so he doesn't count. He'll vote absentee, but one is in Iowa and one is in South Carolina at Clemson. So younger voters don't have that kind of history. And so if you are a candidate, I'm gonna just sound maybe traditional here, where maybe younger voters tend to be more favor the Democrats, perhaps more than the Republicans. If that were true, and are you hooking your wagon to something that is completely unreliable? Because, well, the best thing about an 18-year-old is they become a 19-year-old. What are your thoughts about younger voters and their propensities, or have they kind of ideologically do they bounce around, or what are your thoughts?
Sure. So history shows us that the older people get, the more conservative they tend to be. I think it's really tough to say today where we're headed from a philosophical trajectory at this country. I think that we're at a real divide as you see the extreme partisans on both sides of the aisle going in directions that maybe aren't great for free enterprise, to bring this back to a conversation about the chamber. And I think that it's really critical for the business community, leaders like you, Mike, and the Delaware Chamber, and what we do at the U.S. Chamber, to do a good and much better job communicating with younger citizens about the benefits of free markets and free enterprise. I think that that's critical. And so much of what has been brought up, some of these issue sets, like the Green New Deal, like Medicare for all, like free college, those are tough things we know that somebody has to pay for. And those are the kind of conversations that need to be had, and better education, I think, around the realities of some of these things that sound wonderful, but are going to be awfully tough to pull off without massive tax increases that'll have real ramifications for job creators across the country. Many of the people who would help some of these young folks as they're coming out of college.
Let's talk about, in the time we have left, Ashlee, you mentioned that the 2 issues that tend to be, or that are showing up on voters' minds, are the economy and healthcare. And they're both very broad, labels. Can you identify specifically within the economy and maybe you did, maybe it's jobs, but if it is, can we even go a step further than that? And or on healthcare, you know, what details on healthcare? We had one question that asked about childcare, and that's something that we've partnered with the chamber on as well, because about a third of all childcare providers around the country are not expected to reopen, and that creates all sorts of headwinds for employers and their employees. But so within the word of economy and healthcare, what's kind of, if we dig deeper, what are the two topics?
Sure. So healthcare are all of the things that we're used to thinking and talking about: costs, access, things like that. But now it's become very much focused on the coronavirus, which has introduced whole new elements to this conversation, public policy fight that we're simply just not used to or really conditioned for. Before, I think it was a lot about cost. Now there are questions from voters we're hearing about all the time is, do I have a good doctor? Do I have access to see a doctor? Now, some of the stories out today and through the last week or so about hospitals not having space to take patients in. This takes it to a whole new level. It's the concerns that we had before, but really on steroids that all Americans have. Surprise billing, you name it. The list really goes on, as you know, Mike. I think in the economy, you hit the nail on the head. It's always going to be about jobs, and it's always going to be about pocketbook issues. Do I have the resources? I think about it through the lens as a mom to be able to be sure, putting in childcare into the mix, that I can afford childcare, that my daughter can get a good education, whether it's public or one that I can afford to pay for. And do I have the economic opportunity to go out and get those kind of resources and earn them to be able to provide a better future for my children? I think that the economic conversation, we sometimes tend to make it more difficult than it is. And I've seen this in focus groups time and time again. When you ask voters, what is it that you're really worried about? It's the basic stuff. It's the everyday thing. It's the cost of the electricity bill. It's the cost of the mortgages. It's, of course, taxes and the taxes and the environment related to that. So.
Thank you very much. Last question, and then I've got a couple of housekeeping matters, and then I'll come back to you for a closing comment. But the business community has a very important voice with voters and the public to express the importance of being engaged in public discourse and also remaining civil. It's something that, you know, I've had conversations, and the U.S. Chamber has been a leader in this topic. We had a good session yesterday. Talk a little bit, if you could, just about the role of the business community, because you got a lot of people from the business community on this webinar right now. I think sometimes maybe they underestimate, or maybe because they don't do politics for a living, just how important their voice can be, both in encouraging people to vote and also remaining calm, because it could be some time before maybe we understand the outcome of this election or maybe future elections.
Well, we produced a report with our allies at the Business Roundtable that we released this week, and I think that's what you're referencing, Mike, a document that lists when election results will be certified by state. And as a reminder to everybody that in 2016, it took 30 some odd days for things to be final after all the votes were counted. There's a long and lengthy legal process that goes into this. We are saying consistently to our members and folks on calls just like this, and encourage you to pass it along. Everybody should stay calm next week and have a plan, whether it be in leading your business to just even public safety, depending on where you are, that we could be in for a couple of bumpy days. And just from a reasonable perspective, I wouldn't sit down on election night with my hot tea or glass of wine and expect to know who the results are ultimately going to be at the end of the day. Leader McConnell said it really well about 6 weeks ago that there will be a peaceful transfer of power. The president, when asked in the debate, reiterated that there will be a peaceful transfer of power. I am choosing to believe that it's critical for democracy. I think that we will have clarity in the not too far future. It might be a couple of weeks, and it might be a bit of a rocky road just because we've been living through so much civil unrest. But I do think that ultimately, for the good of the order of our democracy, this will be a peaceful changeover, whatever that looks like, or continuation.
Very good. Ashlee, thank you very much. I'll give you just a minute if you have any closing thoughts. Let me remind everybody that our Superstars in Business conference is coming up very quickly, and Your participation in that is welcome, and we would greatly appreciate you registering and helping us recognize some terrific businesses and nonprofit organizations that have really gone above and beyond and really kind of distinguished themselves. So that's Wednesday, November 4th. And then finally, our chamber leadership event on December 3rd with Jim Collins, who's the CEO of Corteva AgriScience. Jim will kind of share with us his journey into a leadership role in a terrific company, Corteva AgriScience. Jim Collins, Chamber Leadership Breakfast, December 3rd, Thursday at 8:30 in the morning. Let me, Ashlee, thank you again. Let me also thank James DeShane and Armitage DeShane for their sponsorship of this webinar. We appreciate the support of our members. We can't do these things without their help. So James, appreciate that for you and Rick. Ashlee, any last final and closing thoughts? And this was terrific. And thank you very much for being available to do this.
Just thank you to all of you. Really appreciative of the important role that the Federation and the greater business community at large plays. And everybody has a unique opportunity to do, as you said, Mike, encourage your employees to vote. It's important. And then I always end these by saying, don't go into Tuesday thinking we're going to know who won. It might take a while. So just set your expectations accordingly. And we all will be a little bit less disappointed when we don't go to bed knowing the outcomes of some of these races we're really interested in.
That's great. Well, again, thank you very much. Friends, this has been Ashlee Rich Stephenson with the United States Chamber of Commerce. Ashlee, we're grateful to you and everybody at the Chamber. Thank you. Appreciate all you do. And thanks to everybody. Have a great afternoon. And thank you again. So long.